Well, how would you like it if 10 disciples told you they had seen the Lord, but you didn't get to see him? Jesus came to the house where the disciples were staying. There were only 10 of them there, and they saw him. And when they tell Thomas that they have seen the Lord, Thomas, as you so well know, says, I don't believe it. Unless I see it for myself, I cannot believe it. Unless I see the nail prints in his hands, I see the wound in his side, and I can touch those nail prints, and I can touch that wound, I won't believe. Several days later, a week later, the gospel says Jesus comes back to that same house. Thomas is now there. And it seems that he comes back specifically to talk to Thomas. Hey, look, Thomas. See the nail prints? See the wound? It's me. And Thomas, upon seeing the nail prints and the wound, says, my Lord and my God. Well, I want us to probe that story a little bit this morning. First of all, I want us to understand there is so much more to Thomas than we tend to think. We've made Thomas one-dimensional. We've done that by categorizing him as what? Doubting Thomas. And we catalog him as doubter, skeptic, unbeliever. When the truth is, if you study the Gospels carefully, you'll know there is so much more to this man than is found here in the 20th chapter of the Gospel of John. I want you to walk back with me in that Gospel. And we're going to walk back from the 20th chapter all the way back to the 11th chapter. And in the 11th chapter of the Gospel of John, you have a scene in which Jesus is in Judea with his disciples preaching and teaching. And a messenger comes to Jesus and tells him that his dear friend Lazarus is dying. You know this story. Mary and Martha have sent word to Jesus that he needs to come because his beloved friend Lazarus is dying. And so while teaching and preaching there in Judea, Jesus says to the disciples, I need to go back to Bethany. I need to be there with Mary and Martha and with Lazarus. But according to the 11th chapter, the disciples say, now wait a minute, Lord, you can't go back to Bethany. Remember the last time you were there, they tried to stone you to death? And so when Jesus gets the message that Lazarus, his dear friend, is dying, and he chooses to return to Bethany, the disciples tell him not to go back. All but one. And that one is Thomas. And Thomas says to Jesus, Lord, you need to go to Bethany. And if you're going to die there, I'll die with you. There's a lot more to this man than you and I give credit. And just think about this. The truth is that none of the disciples believed the word that Jesus had been raised from the dead until they saw it for themselves. If you go back and read the earliest accounts of the resurrection, which are found in the Gospel of Mark, you'll know that Jesus appeared first to Mary Magdalene, and then when Mary Magdalene rushes back to where the disciples are staying and tells them that she's seen the risen Lord, Mark says none of them believed. First thing I want you to know today is we've given Thomas, as Lisa so well said, a bad rap. We have categorized him, cataloged him as a doubter without knowing the real man. That's going to be important as you continue to listen this morning. And notice this, Jesus doesn't chastise Thomas. In this scene in the 20th chapter, when Jesus returns in order to speak to Thomas, there's not a single indication that Jesus gets angry, that he judges Thomas, that he chastises him. Even when he says, stop doubting and believe, I don't believe for one moment that you feel anger in Jesus' voice, that the tone with which he spoke that to Thomas was in any way chastising him. You see, I think Jesus knew Thomas and knew him well. And he knew Thomas was one of those persons, listen to this, who was more rational than emotional or intuitive. You know people and I know people just like Thomas, people who need to see for themselves. People who are more rational than they are emotional and intuitive. And I want you to hear me very clearly this morning. We do a disservice to a lot of people when we want them to believe the way we believe simply because we're telling them we believe that, without them experiencing for themselves. There's a real caution here. Jesus didn't condemn Thomas for his questions and his doubts, and we need to be very careful that we don't condemn other people for their doubts and their questions and their struggles. They may just be a person who is more rational than you are. Less emotional, less intuitive. Let me tell you something else. They may be a person who's gone through a really rough time in life, and that's affected their ability to believe. I met a man when I was pastoring Murray named Joshua. Joshua was a young adult going to Murray State University. I was at Murray before I came here. And I discovered after some time with Joshua that he was one of the lost boys of the Sudan. Remember that story? The Lost Boys of the Sudan were a group of 26,000 plus children, listen very carefully, ages 4 to 11, who fled their villages in the Sudan when either the army or the rebels came and attacked their villages. And they came in all men, women, and children, both the Sudanese army and the rebels, or conscripted the children into service, much like I. From the mid-1980s, 15 years, the war was, and during that time, there were 26,000 lost boys who fled into the jungle. They walked 1,000, made it at all. Were eaten by lions, killed by hyenas, death, not enough water. Not physically strong enough, too little, too young to make it 1,000 miles. By the time that 26,000 4 to 11-year-olds, there were 3,600 left. And one of them was Joshua. I forget to this day the conversation of Joshua about his life experience. And when Joshua looked me in the eye and said, compellingly, how can I believe in a God when I watched my brothers and my sisters die on the desert and most not make it home to Kenya? Are you going to tell Joshua, well, I believe, so you got to believe? Or are you going to be sensitive, as Jesus was, to the particular stories that people have that make them question and doubt and struggle? As lovingly as I can this morning, we do a real disservice when we don't tune into the stories of people and know what's going on in their lives as to why they may have the questions they have, they may have the doubt they have, they may have the struggle they have. If I've not been there, what's the old saying? If I haven't walked in their shoes, I have no business judging them, and neither do you. Which means this: the church of Jesus needs to welcome doubters and strugglers. We ought to put up a sign. I've talked about putting up signs out there in several sermons. We ought to put up a sign that says, if you're doubting, this is the place. If you're struggling, doors wide open. If you've got questions about the faith, join us. And let me tell you what they can bring us. If we will let the people who doubt and question and struggle come in, they're first of all going to help us understand why people question the faith. Because in listening to them, we're going to learn why the church is not reaching some of the people we're not now reaching. That probably woke you up. Thank you, Julian. We might try that more, Julian. I'll tell you what, I'm looking out and somebody's sleeping, I'll just raise my hand and you up the sound. And I think we've got to welcome the doubters because they remind us the questions that are out there in the world. David Kinnaman has written a book, and this is a compelling. I invite every parent, every grandparent to read it. It's called You Lost Me. why young adults aged 16 to 29 are leaving the church. Every parent and every grandparent ought to get this book. You lost me. Why young adults ages 16 to 29 are leaving the church. And he gives 6 reasons that young adults are leaving the church. And the primary reason, get this, they feel safe questioning. They don't feel safe in church being real. They don't feel safe in the church letting it all out. They don't feel safe in the church being honest. So the first reason we need to open our to the doubters and the strugglers is they can teach us something. And if we're not listening to those questions, are we going to reach them? Second thing is, they remind us we don't have our act together. When they come in, the doubters, the strugglers, have their act together, you know what they remind me? I don't have my act together fully. If I said this morning, and I'm not going to put you like, raise your hand if you got your act together. I don't embarrass anybody. I don't embarrass somebody when you raise your hand and I have to point you out. Anybody here totally together? Nobody. And so when they come in our midst, they remind us that the community of the church is a place where none of us have our act totally together. And we need to. And the third thing they do is they remind us why we exist, to be the loving and caring and open people of Jesus. Right? So when Jesus didn't chastise Thomas, he sent a riveting message to every one of us that we must be careful what it is to indict, write off others who question and doubt. We need to know their stories. We need to know what they're facing, what they're going through. And we need to be a place they feel safe. Listen to me, young people, teenagers here this morning. Young people and teenagers, we got some comments in here this morning. I hope Germantown United Methodist Church is never a place that you don't feel safe asking your questions. I hope these confirmands who are going to join on May the 15th understand we want you to ask the questions, and you don't have to have it all together. You just need to want to try. Now, having said all that this morning, let me close with this. Faith in the end is faith. And that while we're open to the doubts and the questions and the concerns, while we welcome the strugglers, we're a people of faith, right? And when Jesus said to Thomas, stop doubting and believing, he was reminding us, in the end, it is faith. Let me illustrate that. Nobody can ever prove to you that Jesus of Nazareth was raised from the dead. You know why? Because the only place it appears is in the Bible. There is no rational, scientific explanation that can convince any person that Jesus of Nazareth was raised from the dead, period. But I believe it. By faith. Nobody can prove that God created the world. Right? You cannot prove that God created the world. But we believe it. You cannot prove that prayer works. There's not a single person you can convince, if he or she does not believe it, that prayer works. But we believe it. You cannot for one moment prove to somebody that serendipitous thing that happened in your life when you got wisdom that you needed or strength that you needed or hope that you needed came from God. It was a serendipitous gift from God. There's not a single thing you can do to convince anybody, right? But you believe it. You can't convince a single person by evidence that God loves you. But you believe it. I want this place to be a place where the doubters feel welcome. the Thomases of this world know that we want to know their story. We want to hear their life issues. We want to hear from the Joshuas who tell us we just don't get it about the horrors of this world. I want every young person to feel safe here, asking every question you want to ask, even of the preachers. But I also want us to be a place that unapologetically and loudly says, we believe. We believe. Not because we can prove it, because we believe it as people of faith. Let us stand and sing our affirmation together.